How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the channel. This is Concealed, and today we will be discussing the Astro C40 TR controller. And I've spent some time playing with this controller on multiple games and really getting to feel out how this controller works in the competitive aspect and just casual play. I'm a very competitive player, and I will be giving my standpoint on what I think of the controller, positive and cons, and whether you should get the controller or not. Now, I did buy this controller off of the Astro website for around $205, that is with tax, and I did have a lot of questions before buying the controller, and I did watch some review videos on YouTube, but I don't think any of them really grasped a lot of what this controller does and how it comes down to actual competitive play. Being a PS4 player, I have used the standard DualShock PS4 controller throughout all of my PS4's duration. I've never purchased another controller with paddles or anything. Believe it or not, I just used a standard issue PS4 controller, and this was actually my first big investment into a new controller because I just kept having the standard controller break on me, so I thought it was time to invest into a better quality controller to see how it would feel and to see if it would last longer. Now, I primarily play first-person shooters such as Apex Legends and Call of Duty Black Ops, but I've also played it on The Division 2, Destiny 2, and some other games as well. And the first thing I will say is, if you've been playing on a standard PS4 controller for a while like I have, then if you decide to get this controller, you will be uncomfortable with how it feels at first. Now, this controller is much larger than the standard PS4 controller, so it's actually uncomfortable at first. And playing with a standard PS4 controller, I had to get used to the paddles on the back of the Astro, which seemed very weird at first, but once I got used to it, I'd say it took me about 2 to 3 days to actually get really used to this controller and how the paddles work. But after that, it was working flawlessly and it felt really comfortable in my hands. And the other thing I noticed when I first picked up this controller, besides the size of it, was the actual quality of the controller. It has such a good texture to it, and it has a bit of weight as well, so it's pretty heavier compared to other standard PS4 controllers, and it has a nice feel to it. It doesn't feel plasticky and cheap made. Now, for the actual features of the controller, there are 2 buttons on the back of it that if you toggle them, it will make it so your R2 and your L2 can be pressed halfway to activate, so you can actually trigger finger a weapon faster or whatever it may be, whether you want to aim faster or shoot faster. There's that toggle so you can activate it on whether you want that to be enabled or not. I thought that was a really cool feature, so you can just do it on the go whether you want it on or not within just a few seconds of clicking it. And there is the website that you get when you buy the controller, where you sync it up to the computer and you can tweak the sensitivity of your analogs. You can fix the reaction time for your R2 and L2, your buttons, so they react faster or they take longer to press. And on that software, you can map different buttons to your paddles. You can change a bunch of things all from that website alone. Now, the buttons on the Astro felt very crispy. They felt much different than the standard PS4 controller, where they just feel a little bit loose. These ones were very solid. The analogs felt great. The D-pad felt great. The R2, L2, L1, R1 felt great. Everything about it just feels very, very high quality, which it should be because you're spending, $200 for it, but it just feels very high quality, and that's what I like a lot about it. And there are 2 features of whether you want to play hardwired, which you have the fastest response time with the controller and what you're playing on, or you can play wireless, which they give you a little USB you plug in to your PS4 or your PC, whatever you prefer to play on, and you can play wirelessly that way. I did try playing wirelessly a couple times, but I just prefer having the hardwired so I can get that fast response time, which is pretty cool to have. And now, one of my favorite parts about this controller is actually being able to open it up and actually switch the layout of the controller, so you can move your analogs, you can move your D-pad. It's really cool how they made it, and you can completely change your layout in under a minute. They give you a little tool in the box that you can unscrew the 4 screws that are on the controller, and then once you unscrew those, you can take it off and you can switch the analogs to wherever you want to and the D-pad. Now, the main reason I really like this feature is because One of the biggest problems I had with the standard PS4 controller was the analogs going bad on me after a while. And if your analog went bad, there was nothing you can do but buy a new one. And by bad, I mean if you're standing still in a game and your screen would just drift because of the analog. Or I also had problems where I would be aiming and my analog would randomly just flick across the screen, stuff like that. So if the analog was broken, you'd have to buy a completely new controller. But with this controller, since every piece is magnetic, if the analog breaks, you can go and buy another analog off of the website or from any other website that has the analogs, which is really cool in my opinion. Instead of just going and buying a completely new controller, you can just buy the one part that isn't working properly. And I will get into one of my biggest problems with this controller with the analogs in a little bit later in this video. Now, a lot of people do buy this controller because they do like the Xbox layout of the controllers that they have. Me personally, I prefer the PS4 layout, but the cool feature about this is you can switch it to the Xbox feature, which many of you know of. Again, I don't prefer the Xbox layout, I prefer the PS4 layout, but it feels very comfortable in hand. And you have the option to switch to that if you would like. And if you don't like the standard analogs that they have on the controller, they do give you an extra pair of different analogs in the box itself. They give you a shortened analog and a longer analog for people that like the extended analogs for precision shooting or whatnot. I prefer the short end analog sticks, but if you prefer those different analog types, they are there for you. Now, these features really stood out to me when using this controller. It was like nothing I've ever used before. It just felt really crisp. It felt really well in my hands when I was holding it. The buttons felt really quick and responsive. The analogs felt nice and smooth. And I did spend a lot of time testing and playing with this controller to see how everything works. Now, onto the cons. My first problem was the software that they give you with the controller to actually set up the controller itself. It can be a bit confusing when setting it up, and you're basically in there tweaking a bunch of things that you don't really know how to use. So I had to go and look up a bunch of tutorials on how to actually tweak the controller to my fitting, and it will take you a while to actually fix the controller to your playstyle. The sensitivity is the biggest problem I had with this controller. And I did notice that if I was standing still in a video game, my analog would completely drift away. But you can fix that in the software if you just tweak the numbers a little bit. Now, when it comes to this controller in a competitive playstyle, I play very competitive in any game that involves PvP. And I really wanted to give this controller a run for its money when testing it in PvP. I dropped a very high kill game on Apex Legends. I think 23 kills I had. So that was a really cool accomplishment with this controller. The competitive aspect is really there with the controller. But my main problem with it is the analog. Now, I looked up a bunch of Reddit forums about this controller, and I really didn't see any of these problems before I bought the controller. But once I bought the controller and I got to play with it, I started finding Reddit forums where people were expressing their thoughts about how the analogs are faulty. And the right analog on this controller, it might be both, but both of these analogs have really low tension. So myself, I've been playing on a PS4 standard controller for all of its lifetime, and there's a little bit resistance on the analogs. But with this controller, it is very loose, and that makes it very hard to adapt to the controller. Now, when I was in a situation in Apex Legends, per se, where I was fighting really close to someone, it would be really easy to land my shots. But for precision shooting, let's say I'm sniping or using a rifle from someone medium to far range, it was very difficult to land shots with this controller. Not only is the analog very sensitive, it also takes a lot of pressure to move the analog when trying to lead shots on someone. So it felt like it was very choppy movement when trying to hit someone from far away, especially when they were moving. That was my biggest complaint with this controller, and that is the reason why I ended up returning this controller. Now, there is a website called Battle Beaver, which actually sells fixed analogs for this controller for people that had the same problem that I did, where it increases the tension for the analog, so it makes it so it acts more like the standard PS4 controller, where it has that resistance, so it makes it more smooth to aim. But my problem was that this website sells each analog for $20 a piece. So if you wanted to get 2 analogs, you have to spend 40 bucks, and on top of that you already spent $200 on this controller. So in total it would be around $250 approximately if you wanted to get those extra analogs. And I didn't like that idea at all, because this controller is very expensive, and the most important part to it, the aiming aspect, is the most faulty part of the controller. So I was really upset that I spent $200 for the analog to be a little bit screwed up, and I'd have to drop another $40 for the analog to be fixed, when I could go and drop 40 bucks on the standard PS4 controller and have it have, you know, the correct analog resistance on it. But this is where questions get raised on the quality of this controller compared to the standard PS4 controller. Like, the analogs on the standard one are fantastic, they work really well, but the PS4 controller, the standard ones, break really easily. And this Astro controller is very high quality and seems like it will last a very long time with replaceable parts that are faulty, but the analogs don't really work that well. So it is completely an investment that is up to you guys whether you want to use it or not. I've had some really well played games while using this controller on Black Ops and on Apex Legends, so it is definitely up to you guys whether you want to make the risk or not. I will be doing a comparison between this Astro controller and a Scuff controller, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can stay tuned for that video in the future. And I will basically talk about which controller I prefer and which one you should keep. But like I said, I spent a lot of time using this controller. I didn't just play with it for a couple hours. I actually dedicated to just using this controller for days on end and really picking apart the problems I had with it. And the analog issue was really a deciding factor for me on not using this controller, because in first-person shooters, aiming is the most important aspect following movement. And if you have a controller like this where the analog is just very choppy and doesn't really work smoothly, then you're not going to be performing too well in the game. I messed around with a bunch of settings in the software, tweaking the sensitivity of the analogs and whatnot, and following many forums, but a lot of people seem to relate with me on having this controller and the problems with the analog. I saw a lot of forums about it and a lot of people complaining. But other than that, this basically concludes the video. I just wanted to get this out there because I had a lot of questions before I bought this controller, and I wish there was a video like this that really told me about the issues before I bought it. And I did return this controller because of the analog situation, and again, I will be making a video comparing this controller to a Scuff controller, which I just recently bought and tested out. I will be doing a comparison on which one is better and which one I think you should buy and which is better for saving money and stuff like that. So if you guys do want to see that, again, make sure to leave a comment down below for any questions or comments you may have. Leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you are new. I will catch you all on the next one. Peace.